I'm Professor Kenneth Hansen of the University of Central Florida Judaic Studies program, and I'd like to share some archaeological and biblical insights with a little help from AI. It's all about an ancient relic that we might call the Moses Scroll, or perhaps the Moses Manifesto, and I'd like to heartily recommend an important and accessible work on the subject by Ross Nichols, aptly entitled The Moses Scroll. That said, we're about to get acquainted with its mystery and its message, and we might even have a little help from a couple of famous detectives and an archaeologist adventurer who goes by the name Jerusalem Jones. In the late 1800s, a Jerusalem shopkeeper and antiquities dealer named Moses Shapira claimed to have purchased a series of 16 ancient parchments from Bedouin living east of the Dead Sea, where they found them in a cave in today's Kingdom of Jordan. The text, today referred to as the Valediction of Moses, or simply the Moses Scroll, was in Paleo-Hebrew and consisted of an abbreviated version of the biblical book of Deuteronomy. For a time, Shapira put it on display in London's British Museum to great public acclaim. But the scholarly world was skeptical, one scholar after another denouncing it as a fraud. In disgrace, Shapira subsequently committed suicide. The parchments themselves were put up for auction, sold for a pittance, and have long since vanished. But handwritten facsimiles of the parchments have survived, and some researchers have recently suggested that the originals may indeed have been authentic.
Sherlock Holmes here, ready to engage in some serious textual sleuthing. For if they are genuine, the text these parchments represent would be the most important biblical manuscript find in all of history. But to understand why, we have to recognize that the traditional canonical book of Deuteronomy has been declared by many, if not the majority of modern scholars, as nothing less than a pious fraud. Moses could not have written it. As a matter of fact, there may never have even been a Moses. He may be no more historical than King Arthur, or perhaps less. One glaring problem with the book of Deuteronomy is that at the end, Moses appears to describe his own death.
וימות שם משה, עבד השם, בארץ מואב, על פי השם, ויקבור אותו בגיא, בארץ מואב, מול בית פאור. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab. As the Lord had said, he buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Bet Peor.
Oddly, the text never says who buried him. Some have even speculated that he buried himself. Then there's a verse, Deuteronomy 4:27, which appears to predict the conquest of the land by the Babylonians and the deportation of the people in the 6th century BCE, when the biblical Moses was said to have lived nearly 1,000 years earlier in the 15th century BCE.
והפיץ השם אתכם בעמים, ונשארתם מתי מספר בגויים, אשר ינהג השם אתכם שמה. And the Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number among the nations where the Lord will drive you.
That would have made no sense to a bunch of liberated Hebrew slaves wandering in the desert. But that whole passage isn't in the Moses Scroll.
Hercule Poirot here, the world's greatest detective, at least according to Agatha Christie. Another problem is that a large portion of Deuteronomy, chapters 12 through 26, contain the so-called Covenant Code. It covers religious ceremonies and ritual purity, civil and criminal law, and the conduct of war. It details how jurisprudence will be conducted for the Israelites after they are settled in the land of Canaan. For example, it contains rules regarding land use and the pasturing of flocks. But all such matters would have been totally foreign to a large mass of Israelites wandering in the desert of Sinai after their departure from Egypt and long before they entered the Promised Land. They would have been totally irrelevant to the very people Moses was leading, which is why the majority of modern scholars suggest that all of this was added centuries later and ascribed backwards to Moses, who may or may not have existed.
The same section of Deuteronomy also stipulates,
Ki im el hamakom asher yivchar Hashem elechem, mikol shiftechem, lasum et shmo sham, leshichno tidreshu, uvata shama. But to the place which the Lord your God shall choose out of all your tribes to put his name there, even to his habitation shall you seek, and there you shall come. Deuteronomy 12:5.
The obvious reference is to the city of Jerusalem, which the Israelites didn't even know about during all of their wanderings in the wilderness. It would only have made sense centuries later, as the Israelite kings tried to centralize worship at Jerusalem's great temple. Some scholars have also argued that the four-letter name of God, in Hebrew Yud-He-Vav-He, or YHWH, normally translated as Lord in English versions of the text, came to be used by a different biblical source and author, the so-called Yahwist, well after the Israelites were settled in Canaan. Yet it appears throughout the book of Deuteronomy, as evidenced by the most important verse in all of the Hebrew Scriptures, chapter 6, verse 4, which declares, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Eloheinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. However, the valediction of Moses doesn't use the word Lord, Yud-He-Vav-He, or YHWH. It reads, Shema Yisrael, Elohim Eloheinu, Elohim Echad. Hear, O Israel, Elohim our Elohim, Elohim is one. That alone is a major distinction from the traditional text. Indeed, an early strand of the Torah was, according to modern textual criticism, written by a so-called Elohist, who knew only of Elohim and never referenced the so-called Tetragrammaton, Yud-He, Vav-He, or YHWH. Might the Moses scroll come from the same scribal circles, perhaps even from Moses himself? Amazingly, the valediction of Moses is different from canonical Deuteronomy exactly in the portions that are in dispute. In fact, none of the problematical passages are there. Moreover, if we could imagine or fabricate a text that Moses might actually have written, this would be it. Like traditional Deuteronomy, it's written in the first person. Moses himself is speaking, except for the very first and very last sentences, which are likely the additions of a later scribe, bookending the whole document. It begins as follows.
Ele hadvarim asher diber Moshe al pi Hashem el kol bnei Yisrael bamidbar be'ever hayarden be'arava. These are the words that Moses spoke according to the mouth of the Lord, Yud-He-Vav-He, YHWH, to all of the children of Israel in the wilderness, across the Jordan, in the Arava.
The word Lord, the four-letter divine name corresponding to the English letters YHWH, does appear here, as it does in the last verse.
Ele hadvarim asher tziva Moshe lechol bnei Yisrael al pi Hashem ba'aravat Moav lifnei moto. These are the words that Moses commanded to all of the children of Israel, according to the mouth of the Lord, Yud-He-Vav-He, YHWH, in the plains of Moab, before his death.
But both of these are likely later additions to the text. Nowhere else does the word Lord, Yud-He-Vav-He, or YHWH appear in the document.
Whenever God is referenced, the word Elohim is used, which is exactly what we would expect in a text supposedly written by Moses himself. Moses begins by declaring, Elohim Eloheinu diber elenu bechorev lemor rav lechem shevet bahar hazeh pnu us'u lechem uva'u har ha'emori ve'el kol shchenav behar uveshvela uvechof hayam. Elohim, our Elohim, spoke to us in Horeb, saying, You have dwelt long enough at this mountain. Turn and set out for yourselves to go to the hill country of the Amorites, and to all of the inhabited places in the Arava, in the mountains, and in the foothills, and at the coast of the sea.
As in canonical Deuteronomy, Mount Sinai is referred to by another name throughout, Mount Horeb. Moses next declares, Venisa michorev, ונלך את כל המדבר הגדול והנורא הזה, אשר ראיתם, ונבוא עד קדש ברנע. And we set out from Horeb, and we walked all that great and fearful wilderness that you saw, and we came to Kadesh Barnea.
When it comes to the description of the exact wilderness journeys of the Israelites, there are yet more problems with traditional Deuteronomy. The geography seems confused, as if written by someone who wasn't familiar with the lay of the land across the Jordan River. In the Moses scroll, the route makes much more sense.
Indeed it does, Sherlock, as the Israelites traveled first through Seir, then through the wilderness of Moab, then through Moab, between the brook Zered and the Arnon River. Then they pass over the Arnon and battle King Sihon of the Amorites, taking his land up to the Jabbok River. They come to the land of Ammon, fight the battle of Jezer, and fight King Og of Bashan. Then they return to the plains of Moab, opposite Bet Peor, where a love affair occurs with the daughters of Moab and the Midianite women. This affair, by the way, isn't in traditional Deuteronomy, but is instead in Numbers chapter 25. After a pagan sacrifice to Peor, they lastly do battle with the Midianites.
Then there's yet another issue, and a mystery, regarding the so-called 10 Commandments, which might better be understood as 10 utterances or declarations. It's also properly called the Decalogue. In Judaism, the initial statement, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, is considered the first of these utterances. The second is the prohibition against idolatry, you shall have no other gods before me, followed by the prohibition on making a graven image. But all of this can actually be considered the first of the 10 utterances. That would leave 9 divine utterances in total, not 10. In the Moses scroll, however, we have an additional commandment that doesn't appear in the traditional text of Deuteronomy.
Lo tisna et achicha bilvavcha. You shall not hate your brother in your heart.
This is an entirely new, or perhaps we should say old commandment, not found in the canonical version of the Decalogue. Instead, it's found in Leviticus 19:17. And one of the other traditional commandments is stated differently. In canonical Deuteronomy we read,
Lo tisa et shem Hashem Elohecha leshav. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. The commandment is often wrongly taken to be a prohibition against cursing, though what it actually prohibits is taking a useless or vain oath, using the divine 4-letter name. But the Hebrew word for Lord, YHWH, isn't used in this case. The statement instead appears congruent with an ancient source identified by textual sleuths as the Elohist, who preferred to identify God by the word Elohim. Amazingly, the Moses scroll phrases it differently. Lo tishba bishmi leshaker. You shall not swear by my name, Elohim, in order to deceive.
This commandment actually means something far more practical. do not make deceptive or false promises. It has to do with entering into legal agreements, or what we would call contracts. The other commandments read similarly, but there are variations. There's a commandment to observe the Sabbath day, but canonical Deuteronomy says that among those forbidden to work are
ושורך וחמורך וכל בהמתך וגרך אשר בשעריך. Your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates.
Verses like this have always been problematical, because why would tribal Israelites wandering in the desert be instructed regarding their oxen, donkeys, and cattle, and foreigners in their gates? As desert nomads, they didn't have such things, and they certainly didn't have walls with gates. Yet the Moses scroll simply says,
Al ken tishbat gam ata vebahamatcha. You shall sanctify the Sabbath and cease from labor, you and your animal.
After each of these 10 words or directives, we find the statement,
Anochi Elohim Elohecha. I am Elohim, your Elohim.
God is speaking in the first person, declaring, I made the heavens and the earth. This is unlike the traditional 10 commandments, which alternate to the third person speaking, for example, of his name, not my name. The tetragrammaton never appears, and separating each individual word is a dot or interpunct, highlighting their supreme importance in the text. Such interpuncts appear across the text, separating individual sentences, or what we might call verses.
Interestingly, there are a number of texts among the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered decades later in 1947, that are also in Paleo-Hebrew, and in certain places in those texts we also find dots or interpuncts, separating words. In the 19th century, the only Hebrew text known to contain interpuncts was the Siloam inscription, found in the tunnel underneath the ancient city of David.
The Moses scroll also contains vertical lines or score marks on the right and left sides of the parchment, likely to help describe right evenly. But the author, whoever he was, frequently wrote over those lines as if he didn't require their help and wanted to save space by fitting more onto each section of the letter. Amazingly, we also find such score marks in the Paleo-Hebrew sections of the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically in passages attributed to Moses. But the Dead Sea Scrolls were obviously unknown in the 19th century. So how could a forger have known about such scribal practices?
There are a few other important differences between the Moses scroll and the canonical book of Deuteronomy, such as the fact that while the Levites are mentioned, the tribe of Levi is notably absent, perhaps because the Levites didn't become a tribe until later. Then there's the story of the 12 spies who report on what they see in the Promised Land, an important story in traditional Deuteronomy, but absent in the Moses scroll, where we are only told that the people did not want to enter Canaan. It's also significant that toward the end of Deuteronomy, when Moses instructs the Israelites to go up to Mount Gerizim to recite the blessings of the law, and to Mount Ebal to announce the curses of the law, the traditional text only lists the curses, whereas the Moses scroll details out the blessings as well. So while the Moses scroll is significantly shorter than traditional Deuteronomy, here we have a whole passage not represented in the canonical book. At the end of the Moses scroll, Israel's great lawgiver relates,
כן 120 שנה אנוכי היום, לא אוכל לצאת ולבוא לפניכם, ואלוהים אמר אליי, לא תעבור את הירדן, יהושע, העומד לפניכם, הוא יעבור את הירדן, והוא יבוא איתכם אל הארץ הטובה, אשר שמה לרשתה. חזקו ואמצו, אל תראו ואל תפחדו, כי אלוהים אלוהיכם הוא ההולך לפניכם. I am 120 years old today. I am unable to go out or to come in before you. And Elohim has said to me, you shall not cross the Jordan. Joshua, who stands before you, he will cross the Jordan, and he will go with you into the good land that you are to enter there to possess it. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear and do not be dismayed, because Elohim, your Elohim, he will go before you.
It's a condensed version of canonical Deuteronomy 31. That's when, in the Moses scroll, we find the final editorial note that Moses commanded these words by the Lord, YHWH, before his death. Notably, the entire last section of canonical Deuteronomy 31:7 through the end of chapter 34 isn't represented in the Moses scroll. That's when the text shifts to third person, containing Moses' prediction of Israel's future rebellion, his final blessing, and his death on Mount Nebo. Exactly the portions that led scholars to doubt Mosaic authorship.
There's one lingering question. How did the Moses scroll come to be found by 19th century Bedouin in a desert cave high above the Wadi al-Mujib, known in Deuteronomy as the River Arnon? Notably, the location is specifically referenced in Deuteronomy itself.
Kumu su'u ve'ivru et Nahal Arnon. Rise, take your journey, and cross over the river Arnon. Deuteronomy 2:24.
Well, here's a theory. We're told that in the days of Israel's king Josiah, who ruled from 640 to 609 BCE, a book of the Torah or teaching was found in the temple by the high priest Hilkiah. The scroll had apparently been long neglected and forgotten, and when it was read to Josiah, the king rent his garments and brought about a great religious revival in the land of Israel. Have suggested that this was the book of Deuteronomy, which may have been forged by Hilkiah himself, along with Shaphan the scribe. A pious fraud. But might this have been the original valediction of Moses?
Interestingly, the prophet Jeremiah was the son of a priest named Hilkiah. Was this the same Hilkiah who found not a pious fraud, but the authentic valediction of Moses? We are also told in the apocryphal book of 2 Maccabees that when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BCE and took its leadership class captive, the prophet Jeremiah rescued from the temple the Ark of the Covenant, the altar of incense, and the so-called tent. Might that have included the contents of the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, specifically the Moses scroll? We read, "The prophet, after giving them the law, instructed those who were being deported not to forget the commandments of the Lord." 2 Maccabees 2:2. Does that mean he gave them a copy of the valediction of Moses? 2 Maccabees goes on. "The prophet, having received an oracle, ordered that the tent and the ark should follow with him, and that he went out to the mountain where Moses had gone up, and had seen the inheritance of God. Jeremiah came and found a cave dwelling, and he brought there the tent and the ark and the altar of incense. Then he sealed up the entrance. He declared, 'The place shall remain unknown until God gathers his people together again and shows his mercy. Then the Lord will disclose these things, and the glory of the Lord and the cloud will appear.' 2 Maccabees 2:4-8. Could it be that Jeremiah not only buried the ark, but separately concealed the Moses scroll in a cave, only to be found 2.5 millennia later by the Bedouin? Elsewhere, Jeremiah writes of a new covenant. כי זאת הברית אשר אכרות את בית ישראל אחרי הימים ההם, נאום השם. נתתי את תורתי בקרבם, ועל ליבם אכתבנה. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. Jeremiah 31:33. Might Jeremiah have believed that the Torah of Moses would no longer be required when the people returned from their exile in Babylonia, so he buried it out of sight? While all of this is conjecture, we still have to come to grips with the fact that a Jerusalem shopkeeper, also named Moses, Moses Shapira, really did possess a text which he said had been found by the Bedouin very near to the exact spot where Moses had gone up and had seen the inheritance of God. There are only two possibilities. Either it was forged by someone who was deeply familiar with the arguments of critical scholarship, even before many of them were put forth, and who knew what Dead Sea Scrolls looked like many decades before they were discovered, or we're looking at an authentic artifact, the oldest biblical text by far ever to have been recovered. And we have to ask ourselves, what if? What if it's real? Thanks again to Ross Nichols and the Moses Scroll.